So we started with the parable of the burning house. Then we looked at the parable of the rain cloud. That's Kevin. And now we're going to be looking at the parable or the myth of the return journey. So you may or may not have some ideas of this parable. Don't worry if you don't. I'm going to be reading it. And then I'll read it, because it's the first evening, I'll read it in full. It's a few pages out of this book, which is Sangharakshita's teaching of the parable to us. So I'll read it in full, and then I'll draw out one aspect of the various threads in the story, in the parable. And then, as much as possible, we'll get into smaller groups, and I'll give you some questions just to see if anything that I've said chimes with you, or indeed if you have a different response. So one thing, just to put it in a kind of context, this parable was not given by the Buddha. The other two were. This one wasn't. This one was given by, or it was a story explained by the four elders, as they were called. Now, I don't know who these four elders were. And very often in these sorts of things, it really doesn't matter who they were. But it's interesting the context in which they explained the parable. So the Buddha, if we take ourselves back to the vulture's peaks and the masses that the Buddha was teaching to, imagine the Live Aid concert, imagine Taylor Swift concert for the younger ones. Imagine a Taylor Swift concert times 100,000. That's the sort of vast scales of imagination that we're in with the Buddha expounding the White Lotus Sutra, as was very, very beautifully outlined by Padmabhadra when he came a few weeks back. But at some point during this, the Buddha was, as it were, rejoicing merits of Sariputra, who was one of his chief disciples. And he was delighted with Sariputra and was saying that Sariputra was doing so well, he was guaranteed to move beyond his own suffering and actually to achieve full enlightenment. Now, in there is an important distinction. So supreme enlightenment, which the Buddha was delighted to announce, was in waiting for Sariputra, one of his disciples, was above, beyond, and greater than the ending of our own individual suffering. Enlightenment was beyond. And in a way, this is a sort of a theme that underpins a lot of the aspects of the sutra, that enlightenment is greater than just our own individual, ending our own individual suffering or achieving our own individual happiness, whichever way you want to look at it. And as it were, the penny dropped instantly for these four elders, that they had been following a kind of inferior spiritual path. Their spiritual path had been a path towards the end of suffering. And suddenly when the Buddha said, or they understood from what the Buddha said, that enlightenment was above, beyond, and greater than that, they realized their error. And they felt that they had been given a wonderful gift. And their way of explaining the wonder and their joy of receiving that gift was the myth or the parable of the return journey. So it's actually the words of the four elders, in some way in gratitude to the Buddha. They're giving the Buddha the parable of their experience in some way. Is everybody with me so far? Good.
So was it that that they thought that just their own personal end of suffering was the goal, and the Buddha pointed out that it was actually the bodhisattva ideal?
Yes, yes. So in a way, it's the difference between becoming, well, traditionally it's explained as the way of becoming an arahant, which is you gain enlightenment, as it were, for yourself, or the bodhisattva ideal, which is this kind of the major focus of Mahayana Buddhism. I think that's like very simplistic, but it's an easy way to sort of think about it. So make yourselves comfortable, because I'm going to read you a story. So feel free to get into meditation posture, close your eyes, just let this story wash over you. And just don't worry about catching any details, just let it wash over you, and just be aware of your responses. That's the main thing. Just let your responses arise, be aware of them. Forget about details. There's no exam. There's nothing to remember. Forget about anything to do with the head. Just let this wash into the heart and see how it responds. So it'll be a few minutes. They say that once upon a time there was a man who left his father and went away into a distant country. He lived there for a long time, perhaps as long as 50 years. And during all that time, he was miserably poor, roaming around, doing a job here and a job there. He lived from hand to mouth, and all he ever possessed were the clothes he stood up in. Meanwhile, his father was leading a very different kind of life. He was a businessman, and he met with such success in his various trading ventures that he became extremely rich. His trade took him from place to place until he finally settled in another country, where he continued to heap up riches: gold, silver, jewels, and grain. Excuse me. He had slaves and workmen and journeymen, horses and carriages, cows and sheep. He even had elephants. And in the East, if you possess elephants, you really are rich. He also inevitably had dozens of dependents and followers clustering around him in the hope of some reward. His influence in business, money lending, agriculture, commerce spread far and wide, and he lived the life of a merchant prince. But despite his growing wealth and all his business activities, the rich man was never stopped missing his son. How was the boy? Would they ever meet again? Sorrowful at their long separation, his one hope was that one day his son would come home to inherit the wealth due to him. After all, the rich man thought, I am getting old, and one day I must surely die. All this time, the son continued to roam from one town to the next, from one kingdom to the next, until one day, quite by chance, he came to the place where his father was living. Although, of course, he had no idea that he was anywhere near his father. And as he was passing, or rather skulking, through the streets, keeping a lookout for odd jobs which would earn him a few coppers for food, he saw an enormous house. And sitting in the doorway, he saw what seemed to be a very rich man. He was surrounded by an enormous company of people, all waiting on him or waiting for him. Some had bills in their hands, and others had great bundles of money that they wanted to give him. Others had presents, and maybe some had bribes. The rich man was sitting in the gateway on a magnificent throne. Even his footstool was ornamented with gold and silver. He was handling millions of gold pieces, just running his fingers through them. And someone was standing behind him, fanning him with a yak's tail. In India, a yak's tail is one of the symbols of royalty and divinity. So you would only be fanned with one if you were very, very rich indeed, and had been exalted almost to the plane of divinity. Not only that, he was sitting under a magnificent silk canopy, which was inlaid with pearls and flowers, and hung all round with garlands of jewels. He really was a magnificent sight. When the poor man saw this rich man seated there on his throne in all this state, he was absolutely terrified. He thought he must have come upon the king, or at very least some great nobleman. I'd better be off, he said to himself. I'm much more likely to get work in the streets of the poor. If I stay here, they might make me into a slave. And he hurried away, without the faintest idea that the rich man was his own father. But the rich merchant no sooner saw that wretchedly poor man at the edge of the crowd of followers than he knew that this was his son, come back after all these years. What a relief. Now he would be able to hand over his wealth to its rightful inheritor and die happy. Joyfully, he called a couple of servants and told them to run after the poor man and bring him back. But when they caught up with the poor fellow, he was more terrified than ever. They've been sent to arrest me. I'm probably going to have my head cut off, he thought. And he was so afraid that he fell to the earth in a dead faint. His father was rather surprised at this, but he began to see that all those years he had been living in riches, his son had been living in poverty. And this had created a great psychological difference between them. The boy was obviously not used to being in contact with the rich and powerful. But the faithful father thought, never mind, however low he may have sunk, he is still my son. And he resolved to find a way of restoring their relationship. In the meantime, things being as they were, he decided that it would be better to keep his son's identity secret. He therefore called another servant and instructed him to tell the poor man that he was free to go. Hardly believing his luck, the poor man went off with all speed to seek work in the poorest quarter of the town. But he was followed by two of his father's men, chosen for their humble appearance. When they caught up with him, the men offered him work, as the rich man had instructed them to do. The job would be to clear away a huge heap of dirt that had accumulated at the back of the mansion, and the wages would be double the normal rate. The poor man accepted this proposal at once and went off to work with the two men. Day after day, he shovelled the heap of dirt and removed it in baskets to a distant place. He found lodging in a straw hall right next to the mansion, so close that the rich man could see it from his window. The rich man would often look out and think how strange it was that he should be living in a beautiful mansion while his son lived in squalor so nearby. One day, when the poor man had been working at the mansion for quite some time, the rich man put on dirty clothes and, taking a basket in his hand, managed to have a little talk with his son. Don't think of working anywhere else, he said. I will make sure you've got plenty of money. If there's anything you need, a pot, a jug, some extra grain, anything like that, just ask me. I've got an old cloak in the cupboard. You can have that if you like. Just don't worry about a thing. You've been working well, and I'm pleased with you. You seem to be honest and sincere, not like some of the rogues I've got working for me. In fact, well, I'm an old man. You look to me as your own father, and I'll treat you just like my own son. So for a number of years, the poor man carried on clearing away the heap of dust, and he got into the habit of going in and out of the mansion without thinking twice, although he continued to live in his old straw hovel. Then it happened that the old man became ill and knew that he was soon going to die. He called the poor man and said, I feel that I can trust you completely now, just as I would my own son. So I'm going to hand over to you the management of all my affairs. You'll do everything on my behalf. And from that day onward, the poor man was the rich man's steward and looked after all his investments and transactions. As before, he went freely in and out of the mansion, but continued to live in his old hovel, even though he was handling all this wealth. He continued to think that he was poor, for as far as he knew, the money was not his, but his master's. But as time went on, the poor man changed. His father, who watched him constantly, saw that he was gradually becoming accustomed to handling riches, and feeling ashamed that in the past he had lived so miserably. It became obvious that the poor man had begun to want to be rich himself. By this time, the rich man was very old and weak indeed, and he knew that his death was near. So he sent for all the people in the city, the king's representative, the merchants, his friends, his distant relations, ordinary citizens and country folk from round about. Excuse me. Just I was getting to the good bit. And when they were all gathered, he presented his son to them and told them the whole story. When he had finished, he handed over all his wealth to his son, who, of course, could hardly believe his good fortune. There we have the myth or the parable of the return journey. So tonight and over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at specific aspects of that story and trying to draw out their relevance for us here today. So in a way, that was the voice of the four elders rejoicing in the discovery they had made of the wealth of the riches of the Buddha's teaching. So, you've all heard that, unless it just wash over you and see what your responses are. So just as a sort of show of hands, who thinks the father was the Buddha and the son was you or me or whoever? Each of us.
Could you just say, I can't hear the last sentence.
I'll just say, as a show of hands, put your hand up if you think the father represents the Buddha and the son represents us, each of us. Oh, very good. No, you're not right. You're not wrong. If that's your response, it's completely fine. That's the beauty of these parables. You can have whatever response you like. There's no, you're not right, you're not wrong. There are two, however, caveats to that. It's not a complete free-for-all. The two caveats are, one, your response is your response, and if that's your honesty or your truth or whatever, then that's absolutely fine. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the same for everybody else. So you have to be prepared that somebody else might have a different response, and that's equally valid for them. The second caveat is that that's your response on hearing the parable now. We revisit these parables often. So the next time you come across this parable, next year, 5 years, 6 weeks away, it's perfectly all right to have a different response. Because as you grow and develop, so your responses to these parables may well do. So there's two caveats to your response. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of explore the relationship of the Father and Son, but in a more subtle way. So we're going to explore the relationship of the Father and Son, not in terms of the Buddha being the Father and us being the Son, but in terms of the Father and the Son being aspects of us. So the Father is us, the Son is us. We are both the Father and the Son. Now this is quite subtle. It's very, very beautifully drawn out in this Sangharakshita's book, which I believe is out of print, but I think Art City had it as part of the compendium works, that was called. So we're just going to look at how we feel. What's our response to an interpretation of this parable where we are both? We're the Father and we're the Son. And of course, it does remind us, and it is subtly different from the Christian parable of the prodigal son. This interpretation of the Son being aspects of ourselves kind of separates it from any remnants of similarities that you might be feeling between the prodigal son parable and this one in the White Lotus Sutra. So in this sort of interpretation, the Father represents your higher self, and the Son represents your lower self. I'm not entirely sure that I'm hugely happy with these terms. We'll use them because they're convenient. But I think the Father is actually better represented by our enlightened potential, our potential for enlightenment, and what that would look like. It would look different for each of us, as we learned through the parable of the rain cloud. We all grow according to our own shape, our own makeup. So our own enlightened potential will be unique for each of us, but it's an enlightened potential. That's one way of thinking of the Father, where it's us in the future. And the lower self, or the Son, it could be thought of as our current state. Our current state. And one of the things that you have to kind of think about or see is that these two are alienated from each other. Now, in the parable, the Son encountering the Father, so as it were, encountering his potential, was terrified, was absolutely terrified and ran away. Now that's quite strong, quite strong. Might be slightly easier to think of a sense of alienation between these two states. So some of the other things to kind of bring into mind is that the sun, the lower self, our current state, is very needs motivated. His life was all just about needs: food, shelter, clean water. That was it. It was just about having basic needs met. It was a kind of needs-orientated existence. The father, on the other hand, had no worries about his basic needs. They were all just there. They were all just dealt with. They were fine. He didn't have to think about them, worry about them, concerned himself. His concerns, he was very growth motivated. Everything just blossomed. All his investments, everything he touched blossomed. His was a life of nothing but abundance. An abundance of life, of riches, of potentials. Nothing to worry about in terms of basic needs. They just sort themselves. Another aspect from the story regarding the father and the son, or our higher selves, our lower selves, if we bring it together within our own experience, is that the father, our higher self, recognizes the son, our lower self, but it doesn't work the other way. The son does not recognize the father. So when we are in our rather grumpy, needs-based kind of, I just want to be fed, and I just want a glass of wine, I just want to sleep, I just want sex, I just want EastEnders, I just want YouTube, I just want facelift. We are not recognizing, we are alienated and unable to recognize the life of rich abundance that's already and exists within us. Now, everybody in this room must have had some sort of glimpse through a briefly parted curtain, perhaps, but everybody will have some sort of a glimpse of a higher self, of a potential, of some degree of riches, or even just the unsatisfactoriness of a needs-based life, just dealing with the basics day in, day out. And everybody in this room, in a way, doesn't really have to be overly concerned with needs. All of our needs in Cambridge, in the West, in the 21st century, by and large, are met quite nicely. We're thirsty, we've got taps, we earn enough money to buy food to feed us, we have warm beds to sleep in at night, we're sheltered from the elements. But we can find ourselves in that very kind of needs-based way of living, when we're alienated and unable to see the potential of the riches that we're missing. So what I would start by now, so if, as I've been explaining, that this interpretation is ourselves, that we can be alienated almost to the point of fear. The son expressed fear. So if that is what I am proposing as an interpretation of this, then if I look to my own experience, can I find any examples of that being the case? This is what I was thinking about this afternoon. If I'm proposing that to you, in the spirit of a parable, I don't want you to just take that on my account. Can I sort of dig deep, find an example, and in a way sort of prove it, or prove, at least to myself, the truth of this? And I did. I came up with 3 examples of my kind of historical pathway where there was a definite sense of being presented with something that I felt quite alienated from. So the first one was very mundane. It was order members. When I first started coming along to the Buddhist Centre, I've written down here, I was faced with dumbfounded curiosity about order members. I could not get my head around them. They all had funny names, that was kind of okay. But in my world, projecting my world to order members, they had status. They were, important. They were the men and the women of the centre. They organised and did stuff. But they didn't get anything for it. They weren't paid more for it. In my world, if you had status, there was some recompense. If you had less status, you earned less, and if you had more status, you earned more. Here were people with status, but they weren't getting anything for it. I found that immensely curious. As well as that, in speaking to order members, I felt there was a kind of mirror. All my neuroses or prejudices or everything that seemed to be kind of wrong with me seemed to get mirrored from order members. It was like they could just see them, no matter how hard I tried to hide them. There was something about being fully seen by order members that quite scared me. Almost no matter what issue or problem or whatever I might have mentioned to them, they seemed to understand that and they had something really clever to say about it. And I find that a bit disconcerting. But how do they know so much? So I wouldn't say in that particular instance there was a fear per se, but I did feel that there was something quite different about them from me. But actually in that instance, I felt a kind of an attraction. There was a curiosity. It wasn't a total repulsion. There was a curiosity, as well as a degree of confusion about why aren't you earning more money for being an order member? The second area I thought of where there was a definite kind of reaction when I met it was ritual. When I first came across ritual, which is an integral and important part of Buddhist practice, when I first came across it, my little legs just couldn't get me out that room fast enough. I had never come across anything quite like it. And I didn't like it. There's lots of other things about Buddhism I liked, but I did not want ritual. So in that respect, I was quite like the sun. I just wanted to run away. And it took a long time before I kind of became neutral and then became quite comfortable with ritual. And I've had some amazing experiences through accepting and participating in Buddhist ritual. And the third thing I thought of was my own mind. So my own mind met a higher self on long, intensive meditation retreats. So after I'd got over my kind of issues with order members and was happily coming along, I was starting going on retreats. I was going on longer, intensive meditation retreats. And I was following the breath, or I was bringing people to mind. I was being a good Buddhist, doing everything that I was supposed to be doing in the meditation retreat. But as many of you will know, minds kind of do what they want to do. So as you become subtly more concentrated, things will happen in your mind that you might not have expected. So looking back, I was just slipping into dhyanic states. Now, these dhyanic states are very, 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 very pleasurable. They're lovely, they're very, very pleasurable. But they weren't what I was expecting. They weren't what I had been told to experience, as it were. They just kind of came upon me. And it happened a few times, and each time it happened, I was well aware that it was very lovely, that I was really enjoying, but there was a confusion of what to do with it. It wasn't what I was expecting, and I didn't know what to do next. And that confusion around this, it was almost like a slight fright. I would sort of recoil a bit from my own mind being so beautiful because I hadn't expected it. And of course, the minute I recoiled from it, it just went. My mind just went back to being ordinary. So my mind had slipped itself into, as it were, the Father's riches, and I just got confused and pulled it straight back to being here and now and following the breath or bringing somebody to mind. And of course, that meditation experience does kind of mimic the instructions in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Tibetan tradition, which I'm not a great expert in, but as far as I understand, at the moment of death, the mind reaches complete clarity and some sort of oneness with reality, because it's not concerned with you anymore. It's more concerned with reality as it really is. And apparently that can manifest as quite a blinding white light. And the Tibetan tradition is to keep following the light. But most of us are afraid of the light. So we just kind of slip off, and then in traditional Tibetan teachings, we're back onto the wheel of life. We get reborn in the human realm or some one of the realms, and we're back on the wheel of life. So in a way, my own actual meditation experience of slipping into dhyana, not knowing what to do, and then immediately slipping straight back out of dhyana is almost like a tiny mirror of that other deep Tibetan teaching. So another thing I wanted to just draw out for a few minutes before we go to groups was, you might not have had any experience of alienation of your lower and higher self. You might just have trundled along as you are. You might be a bit confused about what I'm talking about. I mean, I suspect, as I said earlier, you do have a vision. You've got some idea, you've had a glimpse of something higher, or you're very unlikely to be sitting in a Buddhist centre on a Tuesday evening listening to somebody giving a Buddhist talk. But another way into this, I think, is in your ordinary life. How much do you feel that you are motivated by the root poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion, and all their subtle manifestations? So if you just think about your daily, life, getting up, brushing teeth, going to work, checking the kids, blah, 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 going shopping, all the mundane normalities of life. How much is that for you about subtle manifestations of greed, hatred, and delusion? How much of it is more coming from a position of generosity, love, kindness, and mindfulness, the opposites of greed, hatred, and delusion? How much are you self-regarding most of the time? How much are you other-regarding most of the time? What do you spend your time doing? Looking after number one, or looking out for others? So I think if you've not had an experience of that sort of alienation of your higher self and lower self, you can think about it in a way, you can think into it, or even better, experience into it, by just reflecting on how you are and how much of you is motivated by selfing and how much of you is motivated by opening up and going out to others. So, because the very fact, just to finish, the very fact of being more other-regarding and less self-regarding was the essence of what the four elders were rejoicing in as the wealth of the jewels and the beauty and the enormity of the Buddha's teaching. So now we like to break into groups, maybe 3, 4s, whatever happens quite organically. And I'll give you some questions. Feel free to just discuss about whatever's live. I'll give you a couple of questions. So, do you recognize a higher and a lower self in you? Do you feel that you have a kind of lower you and a higher you? And the second is, what are your big motivators in life? What are your motivators? Now for this one, so say for example, I would imagine 99% of the room will say, well, I wouldn't mind a bit more money. You know, I'd like to be promoted at my job because that brings more money. And then you might think, oh no, that's greed. You said greed's bad. But actually, I mean, if you're being honest, that's a good thing. So be honest. But if you are motivated to be promoted or whatever, or to get a pay rise, why? You know, so think through the next question. What is it about more money that interests you? It could be a perfectly valid thing. So you might want to, I don't know, buy a villa in Tuscany so that you and your disparate family can spend 2 weeks every summer at the villa in Tuscany and have really good quality time with each other. Well, that's a bit more positive than I just want more money. You know, you want more money for some purpose. So if it's something like that, but in any response, keep questioning, why that? What's that for? What would that give me? Where would that take me? Where does that go? Just keep questions flowing about your motivators.